I've been in the game industry for 30 years now. I started my career at Activision Santa Monica and worked on things like Return to Zork, MechWarrior 2, lead another startup after that, which was called Savage Entertainment, Star Wars, James Bond, Transformers, Scooby-Doo. After that, had a chance to work at Electronic Arts and Sony Santa Monica briefly before finally landing at Blizzard Entertainment.
So you worked practically in every single major company in the world.
Tim Morten's resume is indeed very impressive. He worked at EA, Activision, and of course Blizzard Entertainment, where he was production director on the legendary StarCraft II. He's the man who helped ship one of the greatest strategy games of all time. So when he left to start his own company, Frostshine Studios, the world took notice. He raised over $40 million to build Stormgate, a game he pitched as the savior of the real-time strategy genre. He was the expert, the know-it-all with the perfect resume, the man with the plan. But then Stormgate released and basically failed immediately, and that's what I covered in my previous video. However, one thing I kept asking myself after is, why did Tim Morten fail so spectacularly when he had this vast experience building successful games in the past?
So we did some Transformers games, some James Bond games, a Star Wars game.
To find the answer, we have to look past StarCraft. We have to go back to 1997. 1997 was a great year for gaming. Diablo defined the modern action RPG genre, GoldenEye 007 rewrote the rules for console shooters, Final Fantasy VII made storytelling a cinematic experience, and Age of Empires brought real-time strategy to the masses. It was a year of giants, innovation, and games that would shape decades of design. And right in the middle of that creative explosion stood Heavy Gear. Heavy Gear was Tim Morten's directorial debut. After Activision lost the license to the beloved MechWarrior franchise, they needed a successor, and they put their veteran team from MechWarrior 2 onto a new IP, Heavy Gear. The goal was to build a game that was a spiritual successor to their previous titles. The marketing machine went into overdrive. Before release, Heavy Gear was hyped as the mech killer, with a richer universe and new weapons, and a much more realistic combat environment. Heavy Gear was the game that would make MechWarrior fans forget the Battletech universe. It was a new game from a veteran team, hyped as the successor to a legend. Does this sound familiar? It kinda sounds familiar to me. And the result? The GamePro magazine in their March 1998 issue, for example, ends the review with, "Ultimately, it's nothing more than a disappointing MechWarrior knockoff." Computer Gaming World titled their review "Jammed Gears" and noted, "Heavy Gear just doesn't look like a finished product. I'd love to see a fully cooked version of this game because parts of it show great potential, but as it stands, it's still a bit too chewy to enjoy." And they gave the game a 2.5 out of 5. And finally, we have Computer Game Strategy Plus saying, "What's bad about Heavy Gear is inexcusable coming from a veteran team of game designers." They go on to criticize the derivative gameplay, weapon balance, the paper-thin story, wasted potential, and finally conclude, "The result is a game every bit as inspired, but mediocre as what they have been doing all along." 2 out of 5 stars. Heavy Gear was a rough first project for Tim Morten. A veteran team promising next generation hype, and then a product that doesn't live up to the promises. Was this just an accident or the start to a career-long pattern? After Heavy Gear, Morten founded his own studio, Savage Entertainment, where he was serving as both its CEO and producer. For a decade, his studio specialized in porting big console hits to the PlayStation Portable. The results were a masterclass in compromise.
What's up guys, this is TechRex and today I'm going to review another PSP game. This is Transformers the game for the PSP, and this game is just pretty much awful, I have to say. It's just an awful mistake by the people who made this game. I did manage to almost beat this game, however, I just couldn't resist. The graphics, everything, it's just terrible.
Transformers the game. Heavily criticized by reviewers, GameSpot called it sheer drudgery with aching slow controls and cramped and ugly levels. And the sequel, Transformers Revenge of the Fallen? Somehow even worse. One reviewer called this PSP port utter crap and one of the worst games on the system. Its most infamous feature? In a game about Transformers, you cannot transform. You're kidding, right? A Transformers game where you cannot transform? Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2. IGN labeled the PSP port one of the worst performing games I've seen this year, with a terrible frame rate. Even worse, the game's entire point, co-op multiplayer, was completely ripped out.
Playing was frustrating, awkward, and honestly just felt terrible.
Star Wars Battlefront 2, a cut-down version with an unstable frame rate, clunky controls, and the entire single-player campaign missing. The pattern was clear: get the contract, ship a product, and cut the features, the polish, and the soul to hit the deadline. Now, to be fair, maybe some of this is explained by the PlayStation Portable's technical limitations, or tight budgets from the publishers, a kind of necessary evil in the world of contract porting. But it could also be a pattern of missed potential, feature cutting, and compromised execution. Some PSP ports done by other studios were doing well after all. Morten's next big move was landing at Electronic Arts as the senior development director to reboot the legendary Command & Conquer series. He had big plans for the games, some of which sound oddly familiar for those who followed Stormgate's story.
But as you just mentioned, the key new innovation here is that the content doesn't stop at launch. Really, launch is the beginning of a continuing stream of new updates. We're going to introduce new factions, new maps, new game modes over time, and eventually we'll go back using this same platform and revisit the Tiberium universe, the Red Alert universe, and even some new fictions that haven't existed before in Command & Conquer.
Alright, that sounds very ambitious.
It does indeed sound very ambitious, and as it turned out, it was far too ambitious. After several rounds of testing, the project was abruptly cancelled and the studio working on the game, Victory Games, was shut down. EA claimed it was due to the poor reception during alpha testing, and the player feedback was indeed brutal. Testers were frustrated with the shift to a free-to-play model, the lack of a traditional Command & Conquer campaign, and a progression system that seemed optimized for microtransactions. But according to the people working on the game, the problems ran far deeper than just bad alpha impressions. An anonymous developer dismissed EA's public explanation as total BS, blaming the collapse on internal politics and dysfunction. And a postmortem from another dev revealed issues that fall squarely on the shoulders of the senior development director. First, the priorities were completely backwards. Instead of building a fun RTS, the production was obsessed with the business model. The developer noted bluntly that money talks and bullshit walks. Second, there was a complete failure of leadership to pick a lane. The project was torn between being a StarCraft clone and a classic Command & Conquer game, with leadership allowing competing design philosophies to persist right up until cancellation. And finally, there was a delusional timeline. Just like we saw with Stormgate, the leadership was preparing to ship a product that was fundamentally broken. The game was officially 2 months away from open beta, but in reality, it should have been 2 more years. Now, at this point, it's definitely starting to look more and more like a pattern. Heavy Gear could be written off as inexperience, the PSP ports could be blamed on budgets, but Command & Conquer was different. It was a well-funded and successful franchise, and Tim was positioned close enough to the wheel that his choices and oversight mattered. So, is every project led by Tim Morten destined to fail? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that.
My life for ire.
StarCraft II, the crown jewel of RTS, the benchmark against which all other strategy games are measured. And for Tim Morten, This is the shield, the bulletproof vest he wears to deflect from the failures of Heavy Gear and Command and Conquer.
The first thing I would say is that Blizzard Entertainment.
To be fair, Legacy of the Void was a big success. It wrapped up a decade-long storyline and sits at a respectable 88 on Metacritic. If you listen to Tim Morten, it sounds like he was a big part of that success, but look at the timeline and you get a bit of a different story. StarCraft II's development started all the way back in 2003 and it was publicly released in 2010. Then in 2013 the expansion pack Heart of the Swarm was released. And finally the last expansion pack, Legacy of the Void, was released in 2015. Tim Morten had joined the team just the year before that, in 2014. By the time he joined, all the units, the campaign structure, the entire creative vision was already set in stone. Tim was simply hired to get the game out the door. He wasn't the guy in charge of creative decisions or making the game exciting. That was Dustin Browder, that was Chris Metzen. A production director is essentially a project manager. He was the master of spreadsheets, Jira tickets, and resource allocation. His job wasn't make the game fun, his job was make the game ship. And once the game shipped and the visionaries moved on, we saw what happens when Tim is left holding the keys. We didn't get a bold new vision for StarCraft III, we got Nova Covert Ops, a small-scale DLC that reused some of the existing assets. It was competent, but it wasn't a blockbuster, it didn't set the world on fire, and critically, it failed to convince the higher-ups to invest more. To be fair, Blizzard at this time was a sinking ship, obsessed with chasing Overwatch money and microtransactions, but Tim did try to fight it. Reports confirm he pitched a new Warcraft RTS and even a Call of Duty strategy game, but he was shut down. Tim couldn't convince them that he had a vision worth backing, so frustrated he decided to leave Blizzard and built that vision himself. He was finally going to prove that he was more than just a manager. He was going to prove that RTS wasn't dead. It just needed a genius to save it.
Having the flexibility to take the time necessary to achieve quality. So I never want to be in a situation again where we have to hit a date at all costs. Like, it's important for ideas to have room. It's important to have the time to polish.
Spoiler alert, he hit the date at all costs. I already covered the disaster of the Stormgate launch in my previous video. Check the link in the description if you want the full autopsy. But for those who are new here, here's the Stormgate speedrun. Raised $40 million, promised the social RTS of the future, released a campaign that looked like a mobile game ad, exited early access with a game that was still very much incomplete and lacking polish, and averages 27 concurrent players and sits at a mixed rating on Steam. The only thing noteworthy that happened since I made that video is that the game received its first community update, adding a 2v2 ladder and 4 new units. As the name implies, the patch wasn't made by the actual developers, it was stitched together by unpaid volunteers trying to keep the lights on in an empty building. We also need to look at the ticking clock on their balance sheet, the Silicon Valley Bank loan. As a reminder, according to their 2024 financial report, the company drew down a $2 million venture debt loan in July 2024. While they secured an extension on the interest-only period following the early access launch, the grace period expired on November 30th, 2025. This implies that as of December 2025, the company started having to pay back the loan. And because they delayed repayment without moving the final due date, they likely compressed the entire loan balance into a 17-month window. In other words, they now face payments of over $125,000 per month, while having next to no income at all. Between the volunteers fixing the game and the bank demanding its money, there is a lot to worry about. So what is our visionary CEO doing? Well, he is busy posting on LinkedIn. Welcome to the Stormgate Post-Mortem. Over the course of late 2025, Tim Morten turned his LinkedIn feed into a masterclass in gaslighting. It is a fascinating look into the mind of a producer who cannot comprehend why his spreadsheet didn't result in fun. There are more than a dozen posts, but the pattern is always the same. Step 1. The fake accountability. Part of my job is to make sure Frost Giant's games are good enough, so I'm putting a lot of thought into how I missed. It sounds humble, right? But unfortunately the post doesn't end there. Step 2. The deflection. Players have less time than ever. The market is oversaturated. Constriction in capital. Oversaturated? Tim, in your Start Engine offering, you talked about how this was $1 billion market. You yourself said there were millions of underserved players in the RTS community. And constriction in capital? You had $40 million. You burned through the GDP of a small island nation and produced a game that looks worse than StarCraft II did in 2010. That is not capital constriction, Tim. It's simply a skill issue. But the spiral continues downwards. By October, the desperation sets in. He stops talking about fixing the story or the art. He starts talking about the only thing a producer understands: the tech. My goal is to strike a partnership that enables Frost Giant to capitalize on the tremendous technical investment that we've made in Snowplay. And honestly, he's right, because at this point the tech is the only thing of value left in the wreckage. The lore is generic, the gameplay is derivative, and the visuals are mocked universally. The only asset he hasn't completely devalued is the netcode. So what is his master plan? Does he license the engine? Well, to who? Who is lining up to pay 2 licensing fees, one to Epic for Unreal Engine and one to Tim for Snowplay, just to build a game in a genre that Tim says is oversaturated? He knows this, so he pivots to the final ask. Who can recommend publishers that are actually writing checks in the $5 million range? After burning $40 million, his solution is to ask for $5 million more, to make a new game, to capitalize on the tech. Tim Morten is blind to the simple reality that players don't fall in love with netcode, they fall in love with worlds, they fall in love with characters and their stories. He succeeded at the logistics and did everything a great production director is supposed to do, except make a video game that anyone actually wants to play. So who is Tim Morten? He is not a fraud, he is something much more tragic. He is a man who spent 30 years mastering the how of making video games without ever understanding the why. The paradox of his career is simple. When Tim Morten is hired to finish a masterpiece, the result is Legacy of the Void. But when he tries to start one, the result is Stormgate. The story of 1997 and the story of 2025 are identical. In both, a veteran team promised a successor, and in both they delivered a product that was technically functional but creatively dead. He spent his career believing that if the process is perfect, the passion will follow, but Stormgate stands as a $40 million monument to his mistake. Tim Morten proved he can master the schedule, the budget, and the tech. He knows exactly how to ship a video game, he just doesn't know how to make one.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Narrator dialogue. OK. Button. Alt+O.